Hey guys, this is Jorge from the Big Band Podcast. Today I'm joined by Rachel Christensen. She is the Assistant Director for the Center for Peace and Commerce at USD, and she's also an ecosystem builder or cross-border ecosystem builder, I should say, here in between Tijuana, where I am, and San Diego, where she is. Rachel, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So we're going to talk about a term that you coined, which is, well, we discussed over a chat a month ago or something, that you brought to my attention. You say Borderlander, or you call yourself a Borderlander. You say I'm a Borderlander also. So what is a Borderlander?
Yeah. So I think maybe one of the definitions of a Borderlander is maybe similar to the definition of a hipster. If you are one, you might not identify as one. Somebody else has to tell you you are one. And then maybe you think about it and say, maybe that fits. So I define Borderlander pretty narrowly at first, and then the definition gets wider. So specifically, I define it as somebody who crosses a national border, or crossing between two countries. I define a Borderlander also by the frequency. So I say 2 or 3 times per month for you to really be a Borderlander. So not just you're from one side and now you've settled on the other side, but your life is tied up with social networks, work, expectations, commitments on both sides. But there's a larger picture to the Borderlander. I define it narrowly and specifically San Diego, Tijuana, because that's my context. I also think that Borderlander is a metaphor that can be used for all sorts of different ways of thinking about 21st century reality and 22nd century reality. So we can get into that. But, for the purpose of the beginning of the conversation, I define it thus.
Okay, now a broader perspective about it is that in the context of building bridges, cross, for example, here in the border where we are. There's a lot of talk about creating cross collaboration between San Diego and Tijuana. So from that perspective, a Borderlander, like for example, my whole thing for the last 6 years, I've been living in Tijuana with the sole focus of creating or starting an ecosystem, right? And part of it has to do with, because my whole experience has been, not from here. Or another way to put it is my whole, whatever success I've had has not been in Mexico, has not been in Tijuana. So my whole thing was, how do I bring that to Tijuana and then create from there? So I believe that when we were talking, that you're doing something similar in terms of connecting between the U.S. or the closer U.S. in terms of the border and people from Tijuana, and in terms of sharing perspectives, learning, right. Collaborating further. Because I do believe that every innovator has a distinct trait, which is the need for, and the way you describe it, I love that, is a greed for insight. In other words, it's like you want to have a diverse perspective, and you want to know as much as possible, because then that helps you connect dots and make sense of stuff that doesn't most people would never pay attention to. So and speaking in those terms, how do you see a Borderlanders operating in the border?
Yeah, well, some of it has to do with who Borderlanders are, how they embody ecosystem in their own personhood. So you talked about a couple of things. Ecosystem. I think of myself as an ecosystem builder, much like you. I think of myself as a movement builder. I also think of myself as a bridge builder. So all those things, the build part is the commonality. And why do I think that Borderlanders are uniquely suited to be those builders? For a couple of reasons. One, I see them playing into this new reality because they embody it, because they are constantly code switching. I mean, code switching in the traditional sense, where somebody knows their audience and knows whether or not they should speak to them in Spanish or in English, or Spanglish, or Spanglish that's heavier on the Chicano side, or Spanglish that's a little bit more academic. There's all sorts of variants of the language code switching. But there's also culture shifting. So people are not just shifting in terms of how they communicate. They're also changing from one context to the other context into what's appropriate. Something as simple as you go for a handshake or do you go for a kiss on the cheek? And something as maybe nuanced as, how do I solve this particular challenge? Do I call somebody for a personal reference, or do I look on an online aggregator of references? I mean, these are different ways, and sort of depending on the culture and then how that culture is hybridized, people respond differently, and Borderlanders are able to tap the best from both sides. So in terms of being able to build a binational ecosystem or a movement or a new generation of problem solvers, bridge builders, I do think that Borderlanders have a competitive edge. I think that they're at least 3 steps ahead, because most of the time, knowingly, unconsciously, they are exhibiting the traits that we will need in the 21st century. And it comes naturally because of years of practice and because of necessity. We sure know that necessity is one of the best teachers. So it's not necessarily that somebody woke up one day and said, you know, something that would make me really competitive in the emerging world would be these things. No, it's something that they did because that's what their family or their job or the economic realities required of them.
Yeah, specifically the context. Like, for example, like, I don't know any other way of, and we were talking about this, you know, the time we met. Like, I don't know any other way of operating, which is with people who are all over the world. For me, it's like the first option all the time. I'm thinking, so how would this person look at this situation, even though he doesn't live here or she doesn't live here? Like, how did they approach it? What do they know that I don't know? Or maybe have they solved this problem similar in their location? How would they approach this? And I mean, it's a constant thing of always, you know, it's gonna sound funny, but my second name is Arturo, which is Arthur, and I came up with a technique called King Arthur's Court, which is like having multiple people in a court in my head, and then I go through that court, you know, in my own head, and say, okay, so I might have, I don't know, Walt Disney. I might have a friend who lives in Holland, for example, a friend who's in India, and then I'll imagine them telling me what they're thinking, and then that helps helps me think through some things, even though I'm not talking to them. But I think Borderlanders have that capability because they have to constantly, as you were saying, you have to constantly switching context, and you can't rely on whatever you did yesterday. It's a constant thing. And that makes things very fluid in terms of, now, have you found that people who are not like this have trouble working with people like us?
No. So, I mean, I think some of the interesting things you mentioned that lead me to think no is that you mentioned that it's not just binational contacts and networks, it's international contacts and networks, and that's how you operate. And I find that's true for many Borderlanders. The second is that you mentioned perspective taking, and some of that is just listening and empathy, and some of it is, which is fascinating, your example of court. I actually think I have a similar thing in my head, although I didn't realize it, where I actually had, since I was a kid, when I learned the term la gente, you know, for people, but being plural, even though it's a singular, I played with that idea of, do I have different sort of frames, lenses in my mind that I can take for perspective taking? So in terms of both the expanded international network and the perspective taking, I don't think so. I think for the most part, mature people who, for example, are looking for somebody who would be the next best consultant for their team or team member or an entrepreneur they're willing to invest in, I think they realize that these are traits that are a certain level of genius. And so if that person is secure in themselves and smart enough, I think they would recognize them as assets. I think maybe it's possible, just like anytime. So, you know, there's also a term, third culture kid or third culture person, where you don't really belong here. You don't really belong here. You've created a third culture. I do think that some of the literature and some of the blogs I read about third culture, people say it's a lonely place to be. Find other people. They might not be from the same culture. You know, U.S. Mexico as example. They might be from the border of, I don't know, maybe they're Eritrean, but they've got Ethiopian family members. You can meet at the middle of this common experience of being in between. So I don't think that people have a hard time working with us or Borderlanders. I think they see it as an asset. I do think that maybe one of the cons is it could be a lonely, unless you have a mentality of how do I find other third culture people, it could be a lonely place, because you do find yourself sometimes neither accepted here nor here.
Okay, and how does a Borderlander, I mean, how is a Borderland impactful in terms of for example, yourself, I mean, or put any other example you want if you don't want to speak for yourself. As far as what you bring when you cross the border, for example, here to Tijuana, how do you deliver your value as a borderlander?
So I think some of it has to do with what I've already mentioned, which is the social networks. I really do. My philosophy, my hypothesis is that borderlander social networks are more expansive and they're more diverse. And sometimes it's just as simple as the platforms they use. I think borderlanders are probably just as proficient in WhatsApp and Twitter and SMS messaging. Today, actually, you're actually the third Borderlander I've talked to today. It's been a good day for Borderlanders. I've had two people that live half their week in Tijuana and half their week in San Diego call me today for different projects we're working on today. And we've spoken in English and Spanish. We both know how to call Mexico, call the US from the other country, or just go to WhatsApp because it's easier. So just being able to quickly know what's the right way to communicate is a huge asset. And I find it, even in my experience, I can sort of get a project done earlier because I'm able to use multiple platforms as well as tap into wide networks. So that's one vein. I think the other vein is I've also got a hypothesis that borderlanders predict the future because they're living it. So I think back to your question of how do they add impact, I think that add impact by helping us be able to predict the future and be able to prepare for it before it hits us. So, some of it is because how fascinating it is that you've got San Diego, in some ways casted as the country's most innovative city or growing into that vision. And then you have Tijuana, which both has innovation, and so both San Diego and Tijuana have this innovation part of their DNA. Also, both have extreme inequality, extreme social issues, and many of those issues are shared. So in terms of if you were to select one place in the world where you would probably be able to predict all of the social and environmental challenges the world could face, both in sort of the post-industrial developed world as well as industrializing global south, you'll see both here within 20 minutes. So I can't really imagine too many challenges we would face that you wouldn't see here first because of the meeting of these two different contexts that also have much in common. And so who would be better to be able to predict the future than the Borderlanders? So we're dealing in a season of human existence where there are some real intractable, wicked, what they call wicked, hard to solve problems. And so the impact might not always be that the Borderlanders are individually addressing these issues. I think they already are. I think there are leaders in that area, but I also think that they will be ushering in the new trends, not just how to use technology, but also how to kind of backwards in technology. Some of the solutions to our problems are actually simple, were invented hundreds of years ago. And some of it is also just sort of low-tech solutions that have to do with social networks and have to do with thriving small communities. And I think Borderlanders will be the first to be able to usher those in.
And I would add also that the ability to work with constraints, because it's, I always tell people, yes, there's more resources in the U.S., but resources do not solve a problem per se. It's a component. But I always tell people the way you should always operate, or the way I've always operated, is I don't have any resources. I have to figure it out. It's like going to Africa or going to a underdeveloped country. That's what it is, and it tends to forces you to not think that everything's available. Like if you were in the U.S. or a more developed country, you have to really figure it out. And usually you come up with more down to the ground, useful solutions. Maybe not so damn elegant, maybe not so good looking, but they definitely work. And I think that's so true. Yeah, I think that's definitely something that happens here. Because you just have to figure it out. That's the other way. So another question is, give me some examples of people that like for example, those people were talking about that are Borderlanders and how they operate within the border here.
Yeah, and I think what you said was brilliant too, and it applies to all of them. Is I think that low resource contexts, as well as like a hunger and a necessity to do things, make people into engineers, really good engineers.
Yeah.
So, I've seen just recently this summer, I was in Medellin, Colombia, and I saw some small scale miners that literally use very rudimentary machines to mine gold, and this respect that these engineering students were able to have when they realized the ways that they were able to use the resources at hand to be able to truly create impressive machines. And so I agree. So from like an engineering mindset, an architect's mindset, I think we have a lot to learn from these resource constraints. And that is, I would say, also one of the reasons why Tijuana is booming in terms of gastronomy and beer and wine. And it has a lot to do with the food and the drink, but it has maybe even more to do with the experience, where, if you go to Valle Guadalupe, for example, or if you go to even Telefonica Gastro Park in Tijuana, the way that things are built are leaning into a ranchero, a rancher's mindset of using existing resources and keeping it beautifully simple. And that is something that people want. And so some of the Borderlanders I would mention would be some of these, there's sort of like a class of designers and city planners, placemakers, really just artists in that way, that many times they were trained in the US, or they had a visa, so they were able to sort of like see the breweries up and coming here in the US side, but then able to not replicate, but do something totally new in Baja, to an extent that now there are designers from San Diego. I talked to an architecture professor yesterday who is just talking about how many designers are going down to Tijuana and other parts of Baja California to learn style and try to replicate them in places like Liberty Station in San Diego. So literally the models originating in Baja California because of resource constraints. So in that vein, I can think of a woman named Beryl, who is a placemaker. She wrote the curriculum for city planning in San Diego State University, teaches there. She also teaches at Escuela Libre, which is an architecture school in Tijuana. And so she has these really interesting national placemaking projects where she'll think about, how do we do something at Friendship Park, which is on the US side of the border, that is up against playas in Tijuana. Yeah. Also, how do we redesign the experience when people enter Tijuana, where where people would wait at McDonald's? I mean, it's sort of like a dead zone. So how do we think about, instead of this being a back door to the country, how can this be a front door to the country? Both on the San Ysidro side, which is an eyesore, which could be this brilliant, oh my goodness, welcome to the United States. Instead, it's not. Same thing in Tijuana. It could be like, oh my gosh, this is what it feels like to be in a new avant-garde post-Renaissance Tijuana. Instead, you have to walk through basically a dead zone to get to anything cool. So she works with students on both sides of the border in terms of placemaking. So she'd be one example. There's also people that cross the border because they're cyclists. They take advantage of really awesome cycling opportunities up and down the coast. They go to Rosarito. But then on weekends they come and train in Coronado because they can bike without, it's great to do when it's road closures in Baja California, but if it's not, it can be a little bit more treacherous to bike. And so they'll come to Coronado to be able to bike the trip. And then there's Borderlanders that teach on both sides. There's Borderlanders that are entrepreneurs on both sides. I'm continuously meeting social entrepreneurs that are really excited about finding talent in Tijuana, that are developers, coders. So I think that people cross for many, many reasons. There's people also like myself or my friend Andrew. We're from this side. We don't have any cultural or family ties to Mexico, but we feel that there's somewhat of an affinity for the social groups that we're able to tap into there. So Andrew has moved to Tijuana, relocated there, and crosses about 4 times a week. He's been there since June. People like me that are always sort of considering that move. And it's not because of some of the things you might think. It's not to save money. It's actually, if you ask people why they make the move, they almost always answer, it's relational. It's quality of life. They find more affinity with their friends that they have there. They find a quality of life that's, I wouldn't say slower, but maybe more intentional. Slow food, the whole experience of being able to enjoy time with people instead of always having a life of career only is something that people sort of express when they talk about their move. So those are a couple Borderlanders and totally different reasons why people cross.
So that's what you're saying is very interesting. from the perspective of, number one, I mean, and I don't want to bring up negative thoughts here, but Tijuana, Tijuana might, to people who are not close to here, might look like a war zone still, because we're like the gate to narcos, to a certain degree. But what you're saying is, I've had friends from the U.S. ask me like, is it safe here? All these questions, but I mean, I tell them, listen, I live here. Uh, depends. I mean, if it's like every other city, I mean, there's violence, but there was a time where there was a lot of shootings and all these things because we are a border city. But other than that, it's not like we're in Iraq or something. But I'm happy to hear that the people that you mentioned, look at this or here from the perspective of more like a lifestyle, and that motivates them. So that's great to hear.
And it's not just people like me that are moving south. Also, people that are from Tijuana opted to come to San Diego to maybe educate their kids and are moving back. And so that is also a really interesting phenomenon that we're seeing, people moving back, people opting to move there. And it's not just what you would expect, sort of the retirees. It's folks in pursuit of a different quality of life.
Cool. All right. So I mean, from you told me you're doing a TED Talk, and I guess one of the things that you're trying to do, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, is develop or identify more people like us, and then bring them to similar to what I do with this blog and this this platform of the podcast, which is talk to people. And I don't necessarily look for the people who are well known. I look for the people who are not known, and then try to use my platform to put some shine on them, because I think that's important. And I guess you're trying to do the same with the Borderlanders.
Right.
So explain to me how you're developing them.
Yeah. So I think the first part is just more sort of like appreciative inquiry, and it's the first stage of even the design process that Stanford and MIT put forth, which is empathy and definition. So I'm trying to put definition to this term, this affinity group, this culture of Borderlanders, as well as just understand. So talking to people like you, and it hasn't been too hard to get started because my community of friends tends to be Borderlanders. So my initial strategy has been to, we tend to hang out with people that share some common interests, right, and passion. So what I started was just sort of a concentric circle approach, snowballing, in the research terms. So starting with my friends and then asking for referrals. So my friend Bianca's introduced me to the cyclist that I mentioned before, and to you actually. And then in similar ways, finding friends who have introduced me to all sorts of people, and realizing that it's actually remembering that's a very, very connected community. So probably already knew a friend of theirs. And so from that, I'm able to, right now I have a repertoire of about 20 stories that I've written, stories and photos that I'm putting on my Instagram, which is aptly named Transfronterista. So the idea is that we are crossing borders, the Ista part, because we do it vocationally, not because we do it by necessity, but by choice. Not all of us. Many of us cross by obligation or for economic realities, and I recognize that. And there's also a class of people that do it because of vocation. So the Ista part is the key to what is the motivation for you crossing, and trying to pull that out in the story. So I've posted 2 so far. They come out every Sunday. I will do at least one every Sunday for the next 2 months, and maybe we'll continue. And I'm looking at other platforms where we might be able to feature them. So the first step is just to get the stories out there. They're about this long. They're a paragraph. They come with 3 photos. And then after that, really pull out the themes so that we can figure out how to articulate uniqueness of our experience and the uniqueness of the skills that we bring to the table. So I think that the value add at the end of the day, hopefully, is both giving people a platform where they can be recognized for their interesting story that they have, but also being able to collectively share the themes that emerge so that we can all articulate what it is to be a Borderlander, almost like add Borderlander to your resume, or articulate why you should hire a Borderlander. So that's a little some of the strategy, and I think similarly. One of the ideas is to also develop like talking points about the borderlands, the place, so we can all be reading off a similar script. We'll all personalize it, but how do we not just talk about Borderlanders, but how do we talk about the borderlands in a way that is positive, but not just optimistic, like truly using statistics, truly using stories that you really can't argue with to say why the borderland is the most interesting place to live and why it's actually, why we're advocating for it to be the place to invest in.
Okay, very good. Very good. So you do this through an Instagram page?
Right now it's an Instagram page. I just launched the Facebook to accompany it and getting the stories up there. So right now it'll just be those two places. And then we might find a more permanent home at some point for them, landing page, probably all under the same name of Transfronterista. But we're taking a lean innovation approach to it in terms of just learning,
experimenting
all we can, getting insight, and not trying, having the end in mind, not being so focused on what we think the ultimate solution or thing is that we'll create, so that we're open to co-creation.
Okay. Now, how did you get this insight for detecting the Borderlanders?
Well, I think as most good things, you stumble into it. So, I mean, I think, goodness, I mean, I think I feel like I embodied it to some extent, and it was by accident. So in college, so I'm from the East Coast, but I moved to San Diego for college in 2008. And so by accident, my friend group were border crossers. And so I met quite a few friends that were in San Diego that are originally from Tijuana, and then a lot of friends. I was a Spanish minor, so a lot of friends that would go to Tijuana just to kind of make friends and be able to practice our Spanish in real life. So I think that was just the living of it. And then I sort of got hooked into the extent where I was like actually missing finals and missing class because I felt like the real work was in Tijuana. So I would be going down for different projects and I didn't want to let my formal education get in the way of my learning, as they say. So I think some of it's just living it. And then, as I mentioned before, you just sort of realize that your friends often tend to be similar in a lot of ways. And so I think that was the main thing. But then really, how did the insight come? Well, I just sort of started talking over like beer and things with friends that were Borderlanders, and articulating, I think there's some traits we share. What do you think about this? I've kind of got this theory that we, have some unique traits because of the constraints we have. And one thing we haven't mentioned yet either is literally the physical border. We physically have to wait in a line, even those of us who have Fast Pass or Sentry. There's no limiting that you have to wait to some extent. Sometimes it's 4 hours. And so, and sometimes it's 6. But the concept is I realized that I was having these really interesting thoughts and revelations in the border wait. I started bringing a journal with me and writing them down. And some of it's because you can observe all sorts of fascinating things in the border. You can, for example, you can compare license plates. If it's a California license plate, no matter what the color of the skin of the person who's driving the California license plate, they'll have certain consumption habits that will be different than people with Mexican license plates. Will tend to buy fewer churros, tostilocos, and tend to buy more things that are slightly more American in vibe. So you can literally find fascinating trends by counting. But besides that, the very basic fact that you are waiting in line, something we never do anymore. If we're waiting in line in Starbucks, we'll go find another Starbucks. If we're waiting for our laundry to be done, we'll do something else in between. What else can you do in the borderway except read or observe or listen to a podcast, talk to a friend? So you are in between, you're liminal. You are in between this and that. And so some of the best insights that I've ever had, and my philosophy would be that others have ever had, will probably be happening in this crossing experience. So I think that's another reason I had this insight is, gosh, we're probably the only people that wait anymore.
Interesting. So I think that's another trait that we share, is that because I crossed the border, walking or in car, and it's the same thing. You're sitting there, minding your own business. But I think for us, we just can't stop thinking, and we have to be observing. And what's this guy doing? Have seen this guy before, or what's he thinking? Like one thing that I've always done is, I mean, because like I said, apparently you're the same way. Is nonstop paying attention to stuff. And one thing that I used to do was count the number of letters in the advertising or the adverts that are around the border. For some reason, I started finding patterns that you use the same amount of letters. But I think that was just, I don't know if that was just me, but I started noticing it a lot. And then I said, well, is this a trend, or are they just is everybody, because everybody starts copying themselves. And then I said, maybe they start even copying them the same amount of letters they use, because it's the same amount of letters they're using, and even the same words. But yeah, it's the same thing. I mean, if you pay attention, there's bound to be insights all over the damn place.
That's right.
Especially in a border crossing, that's a very routine thing to do for most people. You'll notice a lot of stuff. But well, thanks for sharing that. Never heard that before.
It's true, and it's the collision of two cultures and two realities, and it's a collision of a very powerful country with a country that is becoming more powerful, but has always sort of had maybe a little bit of an inferiority complex when compared to the United States. And so, you literally are seeing this clash of power where, depending on what kind of passport you hold or what kind of papers you hold, you will have a totally different experience. Yeah. So I've never had a repeat border crossing experience every time, even the ones that appear the most mundane are fascinating. So I do think that it's something that you said is rich in insight for those that want to pay attention.
Do you know people who are in other border cities, not just the one we live in here, in other border cities who are also borderlanders?
Yeah, so there was a really interesting, had a little bit of mentorship from a postdoc student at San Diego State who's from the EU. He really, I say EU because he really has lived in many countries as part of the European Union. And he did some really interesting comparisons of Tijuana with different parts of the EU, particularly lower resource context with higher resource context. And so, yes, I think that he would articulate the same thing, borderlander. So somebody maybe is crossing from Germany to France, for example. Or I was just in Belgium last week, and so it's people that literally speak in a combination of Dutch and French and how the Flemish, all that. So some of it's very easy to perceive because of the linguistic hybridization. Then there's also like the shared culture. So I actually thought Belgium was a fascinating case study because it's the headquarters of a lot of European Union units, like the European Commission. There are people from all over the world there, and it's like nothing. It's like they go home on the weekends and they go Monday through Thursday in Brussels. So yes, and then increasingly over the summer, I've been thinking about this, of course. So I was in Colombia and just really talking to people who thought of themselves as borderlanders between Venezuela and Colombia. Some of it's because people are fleeing for economic and political reasons. And some of it's because there's always been a little bit of affinity at the border where, people kind of cross like there's nothing. And then the last example is I lived for about 2.5 years in Dominican Republic. So would go to the border of Haiti, and the market was literally like a swap meet market on Fridays where people just cross over from Haiti, sailed to mostly Haitian Dominicans living in the Dominican Republic, and then cross back. And then, of course, many of the same trends that we see, which is, you'll send the kids back to Chiapas or Oaxaca or Querétaro for summer vacations or for Christmas. Same things happening with Haitians living in the Dominican Republic, until to a lesser extent Dominicans that are working in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. So yes, absolutely. I think that these are like some universal traits. And my hope is with the Borderlander conversation that people would find their most closest national border and think about crossing it. Even more, they would use the metaphor of how do you cross cultures, contexts without even having to cross a national border.
Yeah, let's put the word out there. Innovation rarely happens in the mainstream, so it happens on the edges, and the edges are always intersections. you know, similar to what's going on here, or
Right.
what you do is basically intersections of different cultures, and it's a honeypot for new ideas, basically, and for new insights. I mean, there's a reason why, you know, Ciudad de Mexico, New York, Los Angeles, Berlin, London are all hotspots. Hong Kong, Singapore. I mean, everybody's in there. You got people from across, all over all different, you know, places, pretty much eating food together.
That's right.
and then food leads to conversation, and conversation or liquor leads to more conversation, and that leads to, you know, some weird ideas.
That's right.
So
totally agree.
okay, so you kind of talked about a little bit about the motivation for Borderlanders in terms of at least the people you know here, you know, the reason they're coming down here or going back there, no? But what motivates you?
Well, I think it's such a good heart question to ask. I think I've always been motivated by making connections, and some of it is because we all get our kicks in different ways, right? So some people are motivated by recognition, in the sort of on stage people clapping for you sense. Some people are motivated by recognition because they made a lot of money, and that signals that they're good at what they do. I mean, there's different ways we're motivated. I think one of the things that motivates me is I like making connections. Certainly, partially because of the credit, but mostly because I really, really have seen throughout my entire life, and this is since I was a kid, that we can do better things together, and not having to always be the center or the spoke that people go through. So it motivates me when I can introduce someone to somebody else, and they don't have to be in the loop anymore. They're able to go do something magical or epic in your words together. And so I think some of it is just like seeing how much cooler life is live when that happens, and also there's a little bit of a level of like believing in karma or something like karma, where I think it comes around. So I think in terms of the long game of life, being generous with context, being generous with time, being generous with wisdom, insight, all of those things only comes back to you in terms of better friendships, better relationships, better opportunities. And it definitely is not always the battle, but it's definitely the war. So I think that those kind of things in terms of life philosophies and principles motivate me to do what I do. And then also just literally just the literal border crossing experience is such a good teacher. Can't imagine a better pedagogy. So as a very quick example, last Friday, for the third time I've done this, I took 8 students from USD where I work. We went to ITT, which is a university in Tijuana, which specializes in a lot of technical careers. Every time we do this workshop, it's with a bunch of structural engineers, sometimes mechanical engineers, and that's where Jorge went. So we went to ITT, and I had 8 students, and 130 students from ITT showed up for the workshop. So it was a lot, but I've gotten 5 emails since Friday from students from ITT just saying, you know, the best part for me was just talking with the students from USD. We really liked the workshop. They literally prototyped certain crazy solutions for crazy problems using design thinking methodology. And sure, they came up with some interesting things. The point was, it's an excuse to get them to work together. Yeah. And so 5 students emailed me, and then the 8 students that I brought, I'm bringing them back across the border. Of course, they're happy because they had churros and they had tacos, and many of them, you know, it was the first time they'd ever been to Tijuana. Some of them are from West Africa originally. They just moved to the US, and then a couple weeks later they're going to Tijuana, and so they're just like, their mind is blown. And some of them are saying, "This looks like home. I feel more at home here than I do in San Diego." And just perceiving that what they were able to learn in 5 hours probably was more than they could learn in the classroom over 5 weeks. Yeah. I think the other thing that motivates me is as I'm sort of an educator, not in the traditional sense maybe, but work at a university and see myself as somebody who could facilitate experiences where people learn. I can't think of better pedagogy than crossing borders. Some of it's just a super pragmatic that motivates me because of results.
Cool. Now, the next time you bring your students, take them to Cocopelli.
Yes, me too.
All right. So I got a few more questions for you.
Okay.
So what is your vision for the next 5 to 10 years of the work that you're doing?
Some of it is back to embodying it. So short term, move to Tijuana, but it's mostly to relocate my bed because, sleep there and then do work on both sides. So that's a short term, and mention it because I want myself as well as others to be able to embody the lifestyle. We can't talk about the border region unless we live the border region, and that means both sides. So that's short term. And longer term, work, I hope it turns into a movement and a conversation shifter, both from as tactical as city planning. I mean, if we could just think about how there's great work being done here. I mean, there's really interesting research coming out of UABC and COLEF in Tijuana. There's interesting implementation planning groups from SANDAG and other entities, Caltrans entities here. Could we think about transportation systems that work for the border region? Now we're having a new trolley line that literally somebody could start their day in Tijuana and they could go to school at UCSD all on the trolley line. That totally transforms how we think about our border region. And former professor, everything. Yeah, so I mean, that's a tactical thing. My former professor, Lawrence Herzog, has a really interesting TEDx he did a couple years ago when they did it binationally at Friendship Park in Playas, where he talks about a vision for a cross-border metropolis. So I think in the next 20 years, this cross-border metropolis could be a reality. So I hope for that. And I think that that's an example that the world needs to see, and there would be replications of that starting in the European Union and elsewhere. And I would love to see San Diego and Tijuana leading that trend and people flying from all over the world to learn how we did it. So that's a tactical sort of thing, but maybe a little bit more it's more from like a casting of vision, and it's a little bit harder to get a handle on. I would hope that we would have really articulate trans-border leaders. So we already have some really, I think it was the UT a couple of years ago recognized 20 leaders from Tijuana and 20 leaders from San Diego who are truly binational. So we have awards, even the TEDx that you referenced before this year. I think that there's 4 of us that are from north of the border out of the whatever there are 12. So there's these signaling that we're doing and recognition that we're doing that we have trans-border leadership. I don't know that that a lot of the training and the experience is in the direction of conscious leadership. And that means sort of knowing yourself, leading out of humility, leading out of a sense of purpose, clear, you're straight on, you're laser focused, that you do it out of a sense of like the collective good. If we had borderlanders that were not just sort of taking advantage of the market opportunity, that's fine. I have no problem with that. I don't judge anybody for that. In terms of, okay, I'm more marketable because I'm bilingual, I'm cultural, all those things. They really had this vision of how can we create more people that are like this so that we can survive and thrive into the future, because this is the future. That would be my vision for the leadership. And I think that there's a couple groups that are really investing in trans-border leaders. And my hope would be that it would be in that vein of like truly adaptive, transformational, conscious leadership, not sort of just like managers that are also good at building their own careers, but really transformative leaders that are making space for other people to come back up.
Very cool. And what needs to be true for that to happen?
Well, certainly some of it is larger political things. There's a lot of scholarship about that. It's an intergovernmental issue to get anything done because you have to deal with Washington, D.C., Mexico City, Sacramento. I mean, you have to deal with 3 levels of government. However, I think that what needs to happen really for things to, we have a really interesting case study in the CBX, right? So the cross-border terminal where you can park on the U.S. side and in a few minutes be in the Tijuana airport, something I use monthly. It's a public-private partnership. So I don't think that the solution, I'm not saying that the solution is public-private partnership, but I am saying that they were able to get through red tape in a way that we haven't been able to with other models. So I am saying that it probably will come down to the sort of theory of reduced transaction costs. So the same way that a business will continue to work with a supplier because at some point they've ironed out all the kinks in their supply relationship where it's smooth, that sort of thing starts happening with cross-border relationships. So it's easier for, after I've met you 3 or 4 times, it's easier, our communication flows easier, me introducing you to a friend, there's a little bit of more rapport there. So I actually think that, of course, we have to deal with the intergovernmental issues, the fact that is literally a national border. But I think that the only way we're going to really move these things forward quickly is, I heard the term the other day, which I thought was brilliant. I don't know who to credit with it, but they talked about non-governmental individuals instead of non-governmental organizations. So who are the individuals that can move mountains because of their, because they're cool, they're inspiring, they've got followers, whatever. If those, high impact individuals, those non-governmental individuals were able to connect and be border leaders, as well as we'll get some creative models like CBX that we looked at, you could actually move the needle on some of these things. And you could do some really, really fascinating things that are around transportation, that are around health, around environment, and that are around sports and leisure, and the economy that we build around lifestyle, which is both relevant to San Diego and Tijuana. So we could have so many interesting lifestyle experiences that are binational, where people would come all over the world to look at it. And then that would probably help government move faster.
Interesting. It's a lot to think about. Well, I mean, I think I don't want to take, because you got to leave. I don't want to take too much time away. Any final thoughts from yourself to my listeners?
Well, certainly, thank you for the time, and thank you for all of this. Further refines our articulation of who we are as Borderlanders and where we live in the borderland. So just thank you. Always, it's an exchange of thoughts, and thought partnership is always well received. I think maybe a final thought would be, I hope that we can also articulate a pride in being from the borderlands. And I hope it's something that people, I think people feel it. I think that maybe initially it was this narrative was so much a narrative of scarcity, a narrative of necessity. And I understand that, because there were real socioeconomic and political reasons why people were coming to the United States, were being invited to the United States to work, some real economic reasons. And I appreciate those early border crossers, and we owe so much to them. And so just only would honor them. I also think that this narrative is getting increasingly nuanced and complicated in terms of who's crossing the border. And I think that's a really interesting new season for us to live into. So I would hope that we'd have a pride about that, and be bold in how we tell people that that's a true asset that we have to offer, and that we come from borderlands, and that is an asset, that's an opportunity, not a liability. So that's sort of the invitation, the convocation that I would close with.
Rochelle, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, your insight, and where can people find you if they want to contact you?
Yeah, so quick ways on Instagram, Transfronterista, and then also at University of San Diego, it's Christensen at sandiego.edu for any kind of email conversation.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, and
thank you for the time.
Yeah, we'll talk soon.
Okay, can't wait. Bye-bye.